The time for member statements has concluded. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister. For more than a week, thousands of Victorian businesses and workers have lived with no income and no hope of federal support. Last week, a senior minister told them to go to Centrelink, even though there was no help available. Today, the Prime Minister has finally announced some support. Prime Minister, what took you so long?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The announcement I made prior to question time today, Mr Speaker, is a standard arrangement, Mr Speaker, as I learnt when I was in New Zealand earlier this week. And after 7 days, Mr Speaker, New Zealand, which has also been a very successful country in dealing with lockdowns, support payments commence after 7 days for post-7 days lockdown, Mr Speaker. In the first 7 days, support payments aren't provided by their national government. Now, in our government, we've taken a similar approach, Mr Speaker. We've taken a similar approach, Mr Speaker, and that is in the first 7 days, if a state chooses to put their state into lockdown, then, as was the case, Mr Speaker, in Western Australia, as was the case in Queensland, where neither of those states, Mr Speaker, made any request to the Commonwealth, and they knew and understood that they had the resources, Mr Speaker, to support those short-term arrangements, and they proved to be short-term arrangements in Western Australia and Queensland. And what we have decided as a government, Mr Speaker, that where a lockdown extends beyond 7 days, then the Commonwealth will put in place a temporary COVID disaster payment. And that payment, Mr Speaker, is $500 a week for those who would normally work more than 20 hours, and $325 if they would normally work less than 20 hours, Mr Speaker. That is a support payment which is not unlike the type of payments that we make in relation to other disasters, whether that's bushfires, Mr Speaker, or floods or cyclones, or the many other areas where the Commonwealth Government provides that disaster relief. And I see this very much as disaster relief for the people of Victoria, Mr Speaker. This is not something, Mr Speaker, they have control about. And with a lockdown persisting beyond 7 days, we believe that is a responsible thing to do, to provide a support payment to those, Mr Speaker, for lockdowns that go beyond 7 days. But the much better outcome, I've got to tell you, Mr Speaker, is that lockdowns do not go on beyond 7 days. The much better outcome, Mr Speaker, is that students can go back to school, that people can go back to work, Mr Speaker, and that they can do that safely, Mr Speaker. And as a result, Mr.
Prime
Speaker,
Minister
the payments
will resume his seat. I don't know what it is about the capacity of members to forget what I've said only the day before, but I'll now issue a general warning. It will make the running of the House far more efficient, and it will save you listening to me for long periods of time. The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, so that is the better outcome. The better outcome, Mr Speaker, is that everywhere we possibly can, we avoid these lockdowns because they impose such hardship on families, on businesses and others, Mr Speaker, imposed. And I welcome the decision that in regional Victoria, Mr Speaker, those restrictions will be lifted. And even still, Mr Speaker, those restrictions are in place in towns and communities across regional Victoria which hadn't seen a case, Mr Speaker, in a very, very, very long time. And those Victorians in regional areas, I know, were denied the opportunity to travel to other states where they were seeking to be with loved ones. So lockdowns, Mr Speaker, are not the objective. Where they're in place, the Commonwealth continues to provide the support that Australians need and rely on.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. The member for CHISHOLM.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister please outline to the House how the Morrison government's economic plan is driving our recovery from the health and economic effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, including through the extension of additional support in my home state of Victoria?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for CHISHOLM for her question. And can I thank again the member for CHISHOLM for the work she not only does in her community in CHISHOLM, but when I was with her recently, Mr Speaker, the excellent work she's doing with the Chinese Australian community, as so many others, the member for Banks and the member for Bennelong and so many others, Mr Speaker, are doing not just in the Chinese Australian community, but the member for Littleproud, Mr Speaker, the great work that he does with those in the Indian community and so many other ethnic communities around Australia, and particularly highlighting and working alongside community leaders to support the pandemic efforts that are being put in place by Commonwealth and state governments. And Australia has been coming through this pandemic better than almost any other country, certainly advanced country in the world, Mr Speaker, and the national accounts have demonstrated that again when we have an economy in Australia that is bigger today than it was before the pandemic hit. There are more Australians in work today, Mr Speaker, than before the pandemic hit, and that is an Australians-led recovery. That is an Australians-led recovery where there was Australians deciding to take on the support provided by Home Builder to go and build their first home, where they're seen in the dwelling investment statistics. Or it's employers who have invested in new equipment through the instant asset write-off and the instant expensing initiative that has seen business investment surge, Mr Speaker, and power this economic recovery. Securing that recovery was set out in the budget this year, Mr Speaker. Whether it's the consumption of Australians and households going out there every day, supported by getting back into work and having that money in their pockets and lower taxes and supporting driving that economy forward. That is what has occurred in this country, and that is not what has occurred in so many other countries around the world. And we cannot take it for granted, and we cannot think that it will always be there. And that's why the plan, again handed down by the Treasurer in this year's budget to secure Australia's recovery, Mr Speaker, is there to support Australians through this pandemic. Some $41 billion, indeed, $41 billion in the second pandemic budget to ensure that Australians all around the country can come through. But specifically in relation to the latest lockdown in Victoria, as I've just responded to the Leader of the Opposition, we are introducing, it will be available from next week, a temporary COVID disaster payment available to those in areas and who work or live in areas that are defined as a Commonwealth-affected area by the Chief Medical Officer. Those payments will be made to them on a weekly basis, Mr Speaker. That payment will be paid swiftly. It's there to help them get through this temporary period. But what we do know, Mr Speaker, is that we want to see these lockdowns come to an end as soon as possible. We want to see kids back in school. We want to see people back at work. We want to see students back in universities, Mr Speaker. We want to see Australians in Victoria going about their normal lives again, as is being experienced by Australians around the rest of the country.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister take responsibility for the 21 failures in quarantine which have led to lockdowns, statewide lockdowns, severe health impacts and widespread economic disruption?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I take responsibility for the decision that we took as a nation in March of last year as the pandemic struck, and as we brought together the leaders of governments around this country in the space of days, Mr Speaker, where we had to surge quarantine capacity in this country to deal with a pandemic. That was achieved. That was achieved, Mr Speaker, and I thank the states and territories for coming together in this way to ensure that in this country there is a 99.99% effectiveness rate in relation to hotel quarantine. And, Mr Speaker, our effectiveness rate in this country, Mr Speaker, even exceeds that in New Zealand, which also uses hotel quarantine. It even exceeds that in New Zealand, who have done an amazing job as well. So, Mr Speaker, I take responsibility indeed, Mr Speaker, for putting in place a situation that has seen over 300,000 people go through quarantine in this country. And yes, Mr Speaker, there have been some 20 outbreaks that have occurred, Mr Speaker. And that is the first ring of steel that is put in place when people come through. And then there is the contract tracing that extends beyond that to ensure that we further protect Australians. And what has been the outcome of this arrangement, Mr Speaker? In this country, sadly, we have lost 910 people, fatalities of COVID. Had we experienced the same fatality rate of OECD countries around the globe on average, that number would be over 30,000. So, Mr Speaker, it is true. I am happy to say that as the Chair of National Cabinet and as Prime Minister, that is an outcome that we have achieved together. Mr Speaker, if you want someone who wants to just take strips off people and fight and get narky on every issue and oppose the government to fix this crisis?
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. To say the Prime Minister had been completely relevant to the question until that very last bit. Was it the last bit? We might go to the next question. The member for Dawson.
My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister, Mr Speaker, and the question is, will the Deputy Prime Minister inform the House how the McCormack-Morrison government's budget investment is supporting business in regional Australia as we recover from the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, it is the Morrison-McCormack government. Then I call the Deputy Prime Minister.
And may that
so
long
either
be
that or rule it out of order. But
and may that long be the case, Mr Speaker. And I do wish the opposition leader well, and I wish him long service leave in that position, Mr Speaker. I want to thank the Voice of the North, the member from regional Queensland, Mr Speaker, the member for Dawson. He is a fighter for his electorate, and he knows that on May 11, when the Treasurer stood in this spot, he delivered the budget, he delivered a plan, he delivered the blueprint for the future for our economic recovery out of COVID-19. It has been a challenging time. It has been a difficult time for North Queensland. It's been a difficult time for Queensland, indeed for our nation and the entire world, Mr Speaker. But the member for Dawson knows that we have the policies in place, that we have the plan, and we're putting it into mode, into operation. He also knows that regional Queensland, regional Australia indeed has been one of the big deliverers as we fight our way, as we absolutely recover from COVID-19 through infrastructure, through construction, through $110 billion of infrastructure across this nation, supporting 100,000 workers. He knows that agriculture has grown to $66 billion, up $6 billion out of the back of drought, fires, floods, cyclones, indeed the virus, the global pandemic. He knows that the resources industry has been its best self, has grown quarter on quarter, and of course the national accounts figures yesterday, very encouraging. They are showing the signs for a great future. Our economy has rebounded into recession through COVID, back out of recession because of the policies and the plan that we have put into place. There are still plenty of jobs in regional Australia. Encouragingly, there are more people in work right now than there were pre-COVID. The unemployment rate is lower than when we came into government in 2013, and they are positive signs for the economy. The instant asset write-off has been such a boon for small businesses around the country. But don't take my word for it. Dion Loader. He's a painter from Mackay and the member for Dawson's electorate. He's got a painting and maintenance business. He took advantage of the instant asset write-off and he purchased a new work vehicle, a Mitsubishi Triton no less. And he said of the instant asset write-off, obviously this meant I had to pay less tax, which helped with my cash flow situation, which had decreased dramatically. It was good to have that little bit of extra help to supplement my JobKeeper payments. He's paying less tax. He's got more incentive. He's got the risk-taking ability that all small business has, and private sector is helping us through this. It's not government, it's private sector. They're the risk-takers. They're the ones that are supporting the economy. They're the ones that are going to build us through the recovery period out of COVID-19.
Time has concluded. I'm reminding people again, I've issued a general warning, particularly to the Leader of the Opposition. It's not a never-ending conversation. Well, as you probably gathered, I'm not as friendly. The Deputy Manager of Opposition Business.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister take responsibility for the failure to fully vaccinate aged care workers, putting frail and vulnerable aged care residents at risk?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, the vaccination program in relation to aged care workers was further reviewed at the National Cabinet some 6 weeks ago. And, Mr Speaker, additional points of availability for aged care workers to be able to get the vaccination were put in place. And again, I thank the states and territories for the work that they were doing to support the broader national effort that was put in place. Now, Mr Speaker, of course, the national vaccination program, which includes the vaccination of all of Australians, Mr Speaker, that is the responsibility of the federal government. I'm the Prime Minister, Mr Speaker. And as a result, I take responsibility for that national vaccination program. Of course I do, Mr Speaker. Of course I do. That's why I take matters to work with states and territories together to get this job done, working with GPs, we'll ultimately working with pharmacists as well, Mr Speaker. And I can tell you today that in the last 10 days there's been 1 million doses delivered. 1 million doses delivered in 10 days, Mr Speaker. Well over 700,000 in the last 7 days, Mr Speaker. 4.5 million. We've gone from a time when we had around 320,000 a week after we had the impact of the TGA assessment of AstraZeneca, Mr Speaker.
The Prime Minister's resumed his seat. The Deputy Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Yes, on relevant, Speaker. The question was particularly confined to aged care workers, not the general vaccine program. If he's got data, some data on aged care workers might be useful.
No, the Deputy Manager of Opposition Business, I remind all members, just simply to state the point of order. And the Prime Minister was asked a very specific question. I think he's answered it in a way that's very relevant to the question. He's now obviously giving some context, but it's not unrelated context, and I don't think the Deputy Manager of Opposition Business can insist that he answer it in another way at this point. As I said, I think the Prime Minister was, on the specific question that he was asked about taking responsibility, I think he's been very relevant to that point, and provided he stays on the general policy topic, I think that's fine.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. And in making reference to lifting the weekly rate of vaccination from 320,000 to now well over 700,000 a week, Mr Speaker, one of the decisions that were part of that was further enlisting the states in the support of vaccination and providing points of contact for aged care workers. Now, at this stage, Mr Speaker, the AHPPC, the medical expert panel, have not recommended that aged care worker vaccination be made mandatory. They have not made that recommendation. They have not made it previously. And my advice, Mr Speaker, is that it is unlikely to be made mandatory on their recommendation either. It is a matter that will be further considered by the National Cabinet tomorrow. I think this is an important issue for us to consider. I note that the Western Australian Premier, when they were faced with challenges in getting the vaccination of quarantine workers, introduced public health orders to ensure that they could increase the rate of vaccination amongst quarantine workers. I think that was a good decision by the Western Australian Premier. I think that was a good decision. Those opposite might find this puzzling, that public health orders can play a role in increasing the rate of vaccination in essential occupations. That's certainly what happens in terms of flu vaccinations in relation to workers in aged care. I note in Victoria, Mr Speaker, that is not a mandatory requirement in Victoria. But what I simply say is there are many methods we can continue to employ to lift the level of vaccination in these occupations. We have increased the points of contact where they can have those vaccinations. We are doing that in partnership with the states and territories, but once again, Mr Speaker, the Labor Party continues to undermine the national effort to get Australia vaccinated.
The Prime Minister concluded his answer. We're now going to go to the member for Indi.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. People with disability in the regions are among those who need vaccine the most. Yesterday I spoke to a highly distressed mother from my electorate whose young adult son has multiple disabilities and a very serious lung condition. Her son cannot access the Pfizer vaccine in his town and could not get an appointment at the vaccine hub 80 kilometres away. Why is he still waiting, Minister, and what are you doing right now to fix this dangerous situation?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Indi. In relation to InReach, as well as the outreach opportunities for Australian disability residents, so far we have had InReach to over 530 facilities around the country. In particular, we note that in relation to Victoria, with regards to vaccines for disability residents, There is a total dosage of 2,878, which has been provided to disability residents, covering over 2,099 people. That's 1,320 who've had one dose, 779 that have had two doses. And in addition to that, we are working to ensure that there is a plan for each resident as developed with their provider. There are 5 different options, depending on the needs of the home and the resident. With regards to the particular individual, I'd be very happy to receive the details. If they are in a group that is immobile, if either themselves or others in their home are not mobile, then they will receive InReach in one of 2 ways, either from general practices or from the specific clinics provided by the providers who are reaching into the homes, of which there have been over 530 nationwide already. If they are mobile, then we're in a position to ensure that they have access to the 30 general practices, primary health care sites within the members' electorate and the Commonwealth Vaccination Clinic. And then, in addition to that, there is access to the state clinics that are specifically set up and taking those with disability, as the Prime Minister referred in his previous answer to the 22nd of April decision of the National Cabinet to ensure that residents and workers in the disability sector are able to attend state clinics. Now, what I would invite the member to do is, subsequent to question time, if we were able to receive the details, we could correlate, understand whether or not an InReach visit has been scheduled or whether the person is able to travel to an outreach site, in which case either way we'll make sure that their needs are met and that they are vaccinated. Thank you.
The member for Moore.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer remind the House how the Morrison government's ongoing commitment to continually support all Australian families and businesses is strengthening our economic recovery from COVID-19?
The Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Moore for his question, acknowledge his experience in local government as well as in the private sector. Mr Speaker, today more than 6 million of my fellow Victorians are doing it very tough, enduring the 4th lockdown. Kids that are not in school, families that are apart, businesses that have been closed. It's a painful reminder that the pandemic is not over, but neither is the Morrison government's economic support. More than $45 billion has already been delivered to Victorian families and businesses by the Morrison government, around 3 times the amount that's been delivered by the state government. And today we announced a new COVID payment to support those in need who have been in lockdown. Now, Mr Speaker, in the budget just over 2 weeks ago, we anticipated that there would be further outbreaks across the country. And this is why we put in the budget an extra $41 billion of COVID-related economic support, including tax relief for more than 10 million Australians, including an expansion of the immediate expensing to boost investment across the economy, infrastructure programs, skills programs, all intended to create more jobs and to boost economic activity. The budget measures, together with what has been previously announced, come to $291 billion in direct economic support provided by this government to help Australians to get the other side of this virus. And this $291 billion and the measures that we have announced is helping to create jobs. And yesterday we saw the product of the hard work of more than 25 million Australians and the direct economic support from this government, with the national account numbers showing that the economy in the March quarter grew by 1.8%. So while the economies of France, Germany, Japan, the United Kingdom all contracted in the March quarter, the Australian economy expanded. And the Australian economy today is bigger than it was going into the pandemic. There are more Australians in work today than at the start of the pandemic. We have done this ahead of any major advanced economy around the world, Mr Speaker. So we'll continue to support Victorians, we'll continue to support Australians, we'll continue to create jobs, we'll continue to lower taxes and we'll continue to drive the Australian economy forward.
The member for Griffith.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister take responsibility for bungling the aged care vaccine rollout so badly that at one facility in my electorate, half of the residents have been fully vaccinated and half have not even received their first dose?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I asked the Minister for Health and Aged Care to add further to my answer, Mr Speaker, but I don't accept the characterisation put forward by the member, Mr Speaker. I don't, Mr Speaker, and I'm not surprised once again that the Labor Party comes into this place each and every day, Mr Speaker, seeking to undermine the government's efforts to fight this virus. We'll keep fighting the virus. The Labor Party will keep fighting us, Mr Speaker, and I know where Australians want us to focus our attention. They want us to focus our attention on them, Mr Speaker, not on fighting the Labor Party.
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And without knowing the facility from the member, we'll have to seek the details. They could have been provided, but obviously that was a decision not to provide those details. 99.7% of facilities around Australia have now received first doses. In addition to that, what we see is that 80% of facilities around Australia have received second doses. Around the country, of 185,000 residential aged care facility residents, there are 156,000, or over 84.1%, that have received a first dose, and all up an average rate of 85% of those facilities which have been visited, and 126,000 have received a second dose. In relation to an individual facility, it does strike me that if a facility has been fully vaccinated, they have received 2 visits. If they have received 2 visits, then all residents have been offered the opportunity to be vaccinated. And it would be a very unusual situation if, having had 2 visits, those residents had not been offered the opportunity to be vaccinated. So, around the country, we do know that there are some, because of their circumstances or because of their families, who have not consented. Without knowing the details of this facility, we would have to find out. But we have made sure that there is the opportunity for every resident in every facility to be vaccinated, and will continue to do that. If there are individual residents who, after having had either a first visit or a second visit, have chosen not to or not been able for some reason to be vaccinated, then we would want to know those reasons. And we have an in-reach program. For example, in Victoria, we have 50 mobile residential clinics which are being delivered during the course of this week. That's assisting both workers and residents around the country. We are going through a program of visits over and above the first and second dose visits. So I'd invite the member to provide the details.
The member for Higgins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health and Aged Care. Will the minister please outline to the House how the Morrison government is continuing to support Australians during the global coronavirus pandemic, including in my home state of Victoria?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Higgins. We know that yesterday Australia had 141,000 vaccinations, another record day. Australians have come forward in record numbers to be vaccinated, and we have now passed over 4.64 million Australian vaccinations. And so what this means, of course, is that we are seeing an acceleration of the program. We're seeing cooperation between the Commonwealth and the state. We're seeing that vaccination program growing and expanding around the country. The last 2 days have each been record days. Between them, approximately 280,000 vaccinations for Australians over the course of those 2 days alone. so well north of 250,000 in just the 2 days, in addition to the other figures which the Prime Minister mentioned. What we've seen in particular in relation to Victoria is we've provided over 787,000 vaccines to the state government, over 900,000 vaccines to our primary carers. Both are doing a very solid job. We know that the Victorian government has approximately 200,000 vaccines in inventory, with this week, during the course of the week, we're delivering another 71,000 Pfizer vaccines, and we're delivering over 100,000 AstraZeneca vaccines to the Victorian government, with 90,000 vaccines going to primary carers in Victoria. That is part of a broader increase of 130,000 vaccines which we've provided, and I've indicated to the Victorian Minister, even though they have significant inventory, if more is needed, more will be provided. I would also note that one of the very important things is the provision of mental health services to Victorians. This is a difficult and challenging time. Any lockdown is very hard, but Victoria, having experienced vastly more in terms of lockdown than any other state in Australia or any other territory, this is a hard time for the people of Victoria. On that front, we have, and I would commend, the 15 Head to Help clinics which are available to Victorians. Whether you wish to call or to visit in person, having made an appointment, that help is available. Those Head to Help clinics were set up very quickly with the assistance of Professor Ruth Vine, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer. We also have telehealth, which is an immensely important support both for mental health, where we've seen over 15 million telehealth consultations so far, or in relation to broader health needs. In addition to that, there is the support through the Beyond Blue coronavirus helpline as well as Lifeline. All of these supports are available to help Victorians during what is a deep, challenging time.
The Minister's time has concluded. I call the member for Cooper.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister take responsibility for the failure to have any idea how many aged care workers have been fully vaccinated?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The total number of workers who have received 2 doses is 35,084. The total, Mr Speaker, have received 1 dose is 41,506.
The member for Lyme.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Agriculture, Drought and Emergency Management. Will the Minister outline how the agriculture industry's strong growth has helped lead the economic recovery from the COVID-19 recession, and how the Morrison-McCormack government's Ag 2030 plan will assist this growth into the future?
The Minister for Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Lyme for his question and acknowledge the rich and proud agricultural region that he represents, that's playing a big part in agricultural stellar recovery, despite the fact that we've gone through drought and fires and flood. And in fact, this week's national account figures show that we've increased our production by 34%. That is a dividend back to the Australian taxpayer for the support that they provided through that drought, fire and flood. Nearly $11 billion worth of drought support, $3.3 billion worth of support during the floods, particularly from north-west Queensland, where we lost 500,000 a head in 24 hours, and the over $2 billion worth of support for the bushfire victims. And this builds on agriculture's foundations to reach their ambitious goal of $100 billion by 2030. But we're also backing it with our Ag 2030 plan, with cold hard cash, making sure that our 7 pillars that support this Ag 2030 plan gives them the foundations to do that, whether that be through international markets, diversifying international markets. And that's about digitising our platforms to make it easier to export around the world. But it's also putting boots on the ground. We're putting men and women on the ground in embassies and high commissions, 22 agricultural councillors whose job is to get market access, commodity by commodity. And in the last 6 months, we've had extraordinary success. Our first shipment of barley to Mexico to go into their beer. We've also secured 750,000 tonnes of barley to go into Saudi Arabia, as well as the Saudis giving us longer shelf life for our meat in their supermarkets. And last week, we secured better fumigation in transit for our grain industry, Lanka, and also the Indians are providing us better access, fumigation access for our grain. And this week I had the pleasure of meeting digitally with my Indian counterpart, Minister Tomar, where we made a commitment to one another to continue to enrich the relationship that we have in getting market access for us in grains and wool, also for them around pomegranates. So we're taking practical steps, taking advantage of those trade agreements we put in place. But it's also making sure that we're going further in supporting biosecurity. Over $400 million in this budget on top of the $888 million put in the October budget. Over $1.2 billion put towards biosecurity in our last two budgets. It's the infrastructure, or whether it's the innovation, giving our farmers the tools of the 21st century to continue to produce the best food and fibre in the world, or whether it's the supply chains, making sure that we understand the vulnerabilities of our inputs but are going further and reaching deeper through our supply chains to value add to our product. But it's also about our people, investing in the next generation of young people, to bring them home to agriculture, to bring them home to regional rural Australia, driving down university courses in agriculture to entice them back to the new jobs of agriculture, of science and technology. So our investment in agriculture is one that is putting the foundations around it continuing to be the bedrock of this nation's economy.
And I call the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister take responsibility for the failure of the $70 million COVID Safe app to assist contact tracers?
Members on my left. Members on my left. The Minister representing the Minister for Government Services.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question, whilst clearly rejecting the premise of it and the number for it. As at the 27th of May, COVID Safe had 7.4 million registrations. With the addition of the Herald protocol, it now makes it the most effective contact tracing app of its kind in the world.
Members
the app
on my
was designed to work in concert with state and territories' contact tracing and to be used accordingly for that. For example, in the current Victorian outbreak, the app was accessed by Victorian officials on Saturday the 29th of May to gain a number of uploads. So it's being used right now by the Victorian Government as part of their response. As we've made the point previously,
members will cease interjecting. The Minister has the call.
The app was used extensively by New South Wales on the 23rd of July, the 25th of July, 544 connections on the 31st of July, and of course 567 contacts in total since the 1st of August. So the app, as a part or concert of suite of measures, is actually being effectively deployed by states and territories with their contact tracing that they're being used, and I would continue to urge Australians to follow all health advice during the pandemic, to continue to use QR codes in terms of contact tracing at venues to allow contact tracers to access and find out who's being there, and I'd continue to urge Australians to use and ensure the COVID Safe app is open so state and territory contact tracers can use it as they incorporate it into their contact tracing measures.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Yeah, can we get the document he was reading from tabled, please? Like, that claim
no, you can't put it like that. I just asked the Minister whether he was quoting from a confidential document. The member for Herbert.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Resources, Water and Northern Australia. Will the Minister outline to the House how the resource sector is contributing to Australia's economy and how the Morrison government's support is delivering jobs and prosperity for all Australians?
The Minister for Resources.
Well, Mr Speaker, can I thank the member for the question? The member for Herbert generally has a smile on his dial, Mr Speaker. There's a number of reasons for that, but two of them in particular. One is the outstanding performance of the resources sector and the jobs that it drives up there in Townsville and North Queensland, and the second one is the success in scoring the State of Origin game next week in Townsville. But, Mr Speaker, on the resources piece, It's Minerals Week this week. Even the superstars are turning out, Mr Speaker, for Minerals Week. We had Tina Arena last night at the dinner. Fabulous performance by a wonderful Australian. And the Minerals Council, Mr Speaker, has released a report about the economic contribution of the resources and the met sector to our economy. $242 billion, Mr Speaker. $242 billion. 1,131,450 full-time direct and indirect jobs. That is almost 11%. 11% of the jobs in this country. That is an incredible contribution, Mr Speaker. But there's more to do. There's more opportunities. There's more growth. And I'm very pleased to report to the House that the price of thermal coal is up over $123 US. That is the highest price since October 2011. That is up 150% in 9 months. Met coal, steelmaking coal, is also up. It's up to $161 per tonne. Iron ore, Mr Speaker, has had record prices this year. It is an incredible contribution to our economy. This is how we pay for the essential services that Australians rely on. Schools and hospitals and roads, whether it's through royalties, whether it's taxes, whether it's the things that all those individuals are doing out there who are working hard. But, Mr Speaker, I'm not asked about alternatives. I'm asked about jobs. Yep. I'm asking about jobs for individuals, and I've met a number of those hard-working men and women in the resources sector over the last year. Tani in Newman, an electrical apprentice over there in the west, working hard at Mount Whaleback. Connor at Moranbah, Mr Speaker. Connor is a fourth-generation miner. He is a third-year diesel fitter employed at Cavill Ridge. He is the fourth generation of his family to work in the mining sector. That is a phenomenal contribution, not only to the sector but to those regions and driving our economy. Congratulations to Connor, because we want more Australians to have that opportunity. We want more generations of Australians to be employed in mining. We want more of them to be trained in the mining and resources sector. And I spoke about that this morning, of course, at the Minerals Week breakfast, about what that industry can do for Australian individuals, for Australia's youth, for Australia's young adults in terms of training and giving them the skills they need into the future. Mr Speaker, Fiona Hick is the plant manager for North West Shelf at LNG. She is an incredible individual, works incredibly hard, well-skilled, and is very, very impressive, I have to say. And it is them that is helping to drive our economy, providing opportunities for our people and our country, and we intend to support them and will continue to support them into the future so there are hundreds of thousands of more Australians employed.
The member for Chifley.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister take responsibility for the failure to manufacture mRNA vaccines in Australia?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In this year's budget, indeed, Mr Speaker, and the work that has been done by the Minister for Industry, establishing that capability here in Australia, together with other states and territories who are working to the same ends, Mr Speaker, and we're to establish that mRNA vaccination manufacturing capability in Australia is important, not just, Mr Speaker, as the COVID pandemic, which we anticipate will extend for some considerable period of time, not 6 months, but for some time to come, but also what has been demonstrated through the COVID pandemic is the efficacy of mRNA vaccines, which 18 months ago, Mr Speaker, was unthinkable. And now they have proven through the course of the pandemic, Mr Speaker, to be an essential part of the future of vaccines in this country. The Australian government took the decision to support the manufacture of the AstraZeneca vaccine here in Australia in August of last year, Mr Speaker, and that has been a vital decision that has ensured that vaccinations have been available, particularly over the course of these early months of the vaccine rollout. More than 4.6 million doses have now been administered to Australians around the country, 1 million doses in the last 10 days. Now, that would not have been possible, Mr Speaker, were it not for the government taking a decision to support the manufacture of AstraZeneca vaccines here in this country. There would not have been a vaccination program in the last several months, Mr Speaker, were it not for that decision taken last August. And similarly, in that context, we have moved forward on the issue of mRNA manufacturing, and I'll pass over to the Minister for Industry to comment further.
The Minister for Industry.
Thank the Prime Minister and thank the member for his question. And of course, it was about 2 weeks ago that the government announced its approach to market for the submission of fully costed proposals to establish an end-to-end onshore population-scale mRNA capability. What we will be requiring from those proponents is the demonstrated access to the relevant IP, for manufacturing processes, for technology transfer and production at scale, the capacity to make products available to the Australian government as required and in priority over every other purchaser, secure supply of population-scale mRNA vaccines for all reasonably foreseeable health emergencies, and it has to have breadth, so it's not just about vaccines for the technology, but about other therapeutics for cancer treatments and cardiovascular treatments. All of these things have to be on a sustainable footing for a facility that will have the ability to produce over 10 years, and an undertaking from the proponents to maintain the capability of that productive capacity onshore on an ongoing basis, and also demonstrate the ability to have exports under that model. And the member's question talked about a failure. There won't be a failure here. Australia will be one of the absolute first-in-line countries to manufacture because of this process.
Has concluded. I call the member for Curtin.
Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. Will the minister update the House on progress that the Morrison government has made on our technology not taxes approach to reducing emissions, and how this approach also creates jobs and supports industry?
The Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Curtin for her question. And as a former Vice-Chancellor and researcher, she knows how important clean technology is to reducing emissions. She also understands how important it is to understand Australia's performance in this area, to talk Australia up, not down, as others enjoy doing, Mr Speaker. And of course, our track record is an enviable one. Our emissions are down 20.1% since 2005, 20.1%, Mr Speaker, the lowest levels of emissions since 1990. We've met and beaten our 2020 target. We're on track to meet and beat our 2030 target, Mr Speaker. And electricity emissions are lower than they have been since records began. Mr Speaker, 5.6% down in the last year alone, Mr Speaker, and thanks in part at least to Australia's world-beating deployment of renewables, Mr Speaker. Highest level of household solar in the world, 1 in 4 houses with solar on the roofs, 15,000 households in the member for Curtin's electorate alone, Mr Speaker. We have more solar and wind deployment per person than any country in the world outside of Europe, Mr Speaker. This is because when technologies make economic sense, Australians deploy them fast, Mr Speaker. We're seeing that every day. Now, as the IEA Director, Fatih Birol, has put it, he's pointed out that the global challenge to reduce emissions calls for massive leaps in innovation across batteries, hydrogen, synthetic fuels, carbon capture and many other technologies. And that's why our technology investment roadmap is focused on doing exactly that. Technologies like hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, and of course healthy soils, Mr Speaker. Now, we've refunded ARENA with an extra $1.6 billion, Mr Speaker, to invest in all clean technologies. Just not a select few. The new funding and mandate has been welcomed by ARENA and many other organisations, 21 businesses, industry groups and peak bodies, Mr Speaker. And through that technology investment roadmap, we'll invest $80 billion as a country in clean energy technologies in the coming decade, creating 160,000 jobs, Mr Speaker, focused on R&D and Australian innovation, Mr Speaker. This technology-led approach, technology-first approach, will see us meet and beat our emissions targets whilst continuing to grow our export industries and jobs. We won't sacrifice industries, jobs, in order to bring down emissions, Mr Speaker. We are getting on with the job.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister, and I ask, does the Prime Minister take responsibility for not delivering on his commitment that he would fully vaccinate aged care and disability care residents and workers who care for them by Easter, and that this has left vulnerable Australians at risk?
The Minister for Health.
Go get him, Jim Bob.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And at this point, 99.7% of aged care facilities around Australia have had a first vaccination. 80.3% of aged care facilities around Australia have had a second vaccination. And what that shows is it means that we have seen 156,436 residents receive a first dose, and of those 126,046 have received a second dose. The importance of these vaccinations has been shown. We have seen at Arcare in Maidstone precisely where 2 residents have been infected. Both have been vaccinated, one with the first dose, one with both doses. And what that shows is that at this stage both residents have been placed in hospital for observation, but not for the symptoms or circumstances that they face. They've been placed there for observation, they've been placed there to ensure that other residents are safe, but that figure of 99.7% is the national achievement to date, with the remaining facilities, due to their own particular circumstances, such as gastro or otherwise, to be done in the coming days. It is a massive challenge, and yet it's an extraordinary national achievement to have seen the inreach right across the country to all of these facilities. To have been able to have done that is to ensure that we are providing protection across the country. That's our task, and that's what we've achieved.
Has the minister concluded? The minister's concluded. We'll go to the next question, and that is the member for Fairfax.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and my question goes to the Minister for the Environment. Will the minister please update the House on how the Morrison government is protecting our iconic marine environment and also the Australian jobs that go with it?
The Minister for the Environment. The member for Macarthur will leave under 94A. It ought to be obvious, but I just remind members general warnings don't have an expiry date during the day. The Minister for the Environment.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for Fairfax for his question and also thank him for his passion addressing the threats on our environment from feral animals. Our oceans, Mr Speaker, are part of our national identity. They're critical to the daily lives of millions of Australians. Around 85% of our population lives 50 kilometres or closer to the coast, so every Australian understands the vital role that our oceans play. They help underpin our economy, supporting more than 400,000 Australian jobs. Through the last budget, Australia's position as a global leader on ocean and marine management will be further strengthened with an additional $100 million for a new Oceans Leadership Package, supporting not just our environment but so many diverse jobs all along our coastline through industries such as tourism, recreational fishing, the trades and training, national park management and so on. The Oceans Leadership Package includes an expansion of our marine park network into the Indian Ocean territories. It will cover up to 740,000 square kilometres and protect the level of Australian waters up from 37 to 45%, possibly the largest network of marine parks in the world. Our package includes funding for 2 additional rounds of the successful Our Marine Parks Grants program, creating more opportunities for industries, communities and Indigenous communities. And funding from a previous round supported the tuna industry to help achieve the blue fish tick for sustainable fishing, adding to the value of their catch. We will find ways, Mr Speaker, to invest in new technology to prevent marine bycatch, and the sight of turtles and dugongs caught up in discarded fishing nets truly enhances our determination to do that. We want to eradicate invasive species from our islands, such as foxes and cats, and some of the work we're already doing includes our Nest to Ocean Turtle Protection Program in the member's home state. It protects turtle nests from feral pigs, and so far it's protected $1.3 million hatchlings that have now made their way into the ocean and overseas. This work builds on our previous work in oceans in our last budget, which was establishing oyster reefs, so important for communities, coastal communities, wherever we find them. We're delivering cleaner beaches, we're increasing fish stocks, we're protecting turtles and seabirds, supporting our coastal and Indigenous communities, and we're supporting those that rely on the oceans for their livelihood. This package continues that work.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister take responsibility for the words that came out of his own mouth, that the vaccine rollout is not a race?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I addressed this matter earlier this week. And, Mr Speaker, I stood by the comments as they were made at the time, Mr Speaker, and I concur with the statements made by Professor Ben Murphy, Mr Speaker, at that time and since in Senate estimates.
The member for Bruce will leave
I note that these are similar comments that were
94A.
made by Queensland Health, Mr Speaker. I noticed there's similar comments, Mr Speaker, that were made by Dr Khurshid, the head of the AMA, Mr Speaker. If the opposition leader believes this is a matter, Mr Speaker, that he wishes to continue to pursue, I'm happy to continue answering. Yes, I said that, Mr Speaker. It's imperative that we move forward as quickly as possible in relation to the vaccination program, and that's why I'm pleased that 141,000 doses were delivered in the last 24 hours. I'm very pleased that in the last week there's been over 720,000 doses. Over 700,000 doses in 7 days, Mr Speaker. I'm very pleased, Mr Speaker, that we saw 2 million doses delivered in the last month, when it took us over 2 months to do the first 2 million doses, Mr Speaker. I'm very pleased that the vaccination program continues to gather pace. I'm very appreciative of the role that is being played by state and territory governments and GPs around the country. We're all, Mr Speaker, the Australian government, the states and territories, the GPs, Mr Speaker, we're all getting on with the job, and indeed pharmacists will become part of this. I'm very appreciative of the role of the Royal Flying Doctor Service, Mr Speaker, going out and supporting 80,000 Australians.
Right.
We're all getting on with that job, Mr Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition is just engaged in one job, Mr Speaker: undermine the government.
The member for Moncrieff, sorry.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence. Will the Minister inform the House on how the Morrison government is investing in defence and working with our strategic partners to secure our region? And is the Minister aware of any threats to the confidence of our regional partners?
The Minister for Defence.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for her question, and I want to commend the work of the Australian Defence Force in keeping our country safe and secure. This government is investing $270 billion into capability over this decade alone. When Labor was in government, they ripped $18 billion out of defence, and it was a very significant blow to the men and women of the Australian Defence Force, Mr Speaker, and they haven't forgotten. Mr Speaker, we are, at the moment, as all Australians know, dealing with the reality of coercive statecraft, which is becoming an increasingly serious regional concern. Economic coercion, foreign interference and cyber attacks have all escalated in recent times. Australia is investing, as I say, in defence and in working with our allies and partners to counter the use of coercion in the Indo-Pacific, Mr Speaker. Our government is making sure that we are putting support into improved situational awareness, into cyber, into special forces, into electronic warfare and information operation capabilities to make sure that we protect our sovereignty and to respond to these and other so-called grey zone activities. So, Mr Speaker, it is absolutely essential that we work hand in glove with those partners in the region, and they expect our country to have a united face in response to this threat. Mr Speaker, so imagine their alarm, imagine our alarm when you read the article by Phil Curry in this week's Australian Financial Review, and he spoke about a speech given by the Leader of the Opposition and a stance taken by Senator Wong in relation to these important issues, Mr Speaker. In Mr Curry's article, he says Senator Wong's comments raise concerns among regional allies about a fracturing of the bipartisanship towards China. That's what Mr Curry had to say. And, Mr Speaker, it details the Leader of the Opposition's speech, where he seeks to undermine our national position in relation to these important matters. Now, Mr Speaker, Australians understand that this Leader of the Opposition flip-flops on issues. They understand that the Labor Party has a policy which is not consistent, even in relation to the vaccine rollout. He tells one audience one thing and tells the next audience the opposite, Mr Speaker. That's what you expect from this Leader of the Opposition, but we would have expected more from the Labor Party in relation to this issue of national importance. The fact is, Mr Speaker, he has failed.
The member for Wills will leave understanding order 94A.
The Labor Party, when they were in government, ripped money out of defence, and they do not have the capacity, Mr Speaker, to hold a consistent policy position which is in our national interest, and Australians are seeing through him.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I move that so much of standing orders be suspended as would prevent the Leader of the Opposition moving the following motion immediately. That the House 1 notes A. The Prime Minister's refusal to take responsibility for his failures in quarantine, which have led to citywide lockdowns, statewide lockdowns and severe health impacts. B. The Prime Minister's refusal to take responsibility for his failure to vaccinate aged care workers, which has put frail and vulnerable aged care residents at risk. C. The Prime Minister's refusal to take responsibility for his failure to vaccinate disability care workers, which has put disability care residents at risk. D. The Prime Minister's refusal to take responsibility for the failure of his COVID-safe app to assist contact tracers. E. The Prime Minister's refusal to take responsibility for the impact of him saying the vaccine rollout is not a race. F. The Prime Minister's refusal to take responsibility for the failure of his vaccine communications. G. The Prime Minister's refusal to take responsibility for his failure to secure sufficient doses of vaccines to vaccinate all Australians by October. H. The Prime Minister's refusal to take responsibility for his failure to manufacture mRNA vaccines in Australia. And I, the Prime Minister, always takes responsibility for the successes of others, but not the failures of his own. And 2, therefore calls on the Prime Minister to take responsibility for his failures and fix them instead of blaming everything and everyone else. Mr Speaker, earlier today the Prime Minister said we shouldn't be scared of this virus.
The Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, I move that the member be no longer heard.
Question is the Leader of the Opposition be no further heard. All those of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. Aye. The ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 4 minutes. Lock the doors. The question is the Leader of the Opposition be no further heard. The ayes will pass to the right of the chair, the noes to the left. I appoint the honourable members for Nichols and Gray, tellers for the ayes, and the honourable members for Lawler and Werriwa, tellers for the noes. Order. The result of the division is ayes 68, noes 60, and so the question is therefore resolved in the affirmative. Is the motion moved by the Leader of the Opposition seconded? The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Seconded. Nothing is more certain than this Prime Minister passing the buck. He takes responsibility for nothing.
The Leader of the House.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I move the amendment be no longer heard.
Question is the Deputy Leader of the Opposition be no further heard. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 1 minute. Lock the doors. I appoint the same tellers as the previous division. Members must remain in their seats unless they're changing their vote or didn't vote in the last division, in which case they must report to the tellers. Order. The result of the division is ayes 68, noes 60. The question's therefore resolved in the affirmative. The question now is that the motion moved by the Honourable the Leader of the Opposition be disagreed to. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. If the ayes have it, division required. Ring the bells for 1 minute. Lock the doors. Point the same tellers as the previous division. Members must remain in their seats unless they're changing their vote or did not vote in the last division. Order. The result of the division is aye 71, noes 56. The question is therefore resolved in the affirmative, and the call goes to the government side. Sorry, the member for Sturt was seeking the call. The member for
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister please inform the House of the significance surrounding Australia's invitation to participate in next week's G7 summit, and how the Morrison government will be using this opportunity to advance our national interest?
The Prime Minister has the call.
And I thank the member for Sturt for his question. And indeed, at the end of next week, I will be at the G7 Plus summit in the United Kingdom, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very pleased that Australia has received that invitation from the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and it follows the invitations in the preceding 2 years, Mr. Speaker. This has proved to be a very important forum for Australia to gather together with like-minded liberal democracies around the world, similarly advanced economies, to address the many challenges that liberal democracies around the world face, be it in the economic arena, be it in the security arena, Mr. Speaker, be it in the health arena or in the environmental arena, Mr. Speaker. I'm looking forward to having the opportunity to discuss all of these issues further with the President of the United States, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, the President of France, Mr. Speaker, and in particular the Prime Minister of Japan on the way to the G7 Plus summit, Mr. Speaker. I'll be taking the opportunity to meet with one of Australia's most important ASEAN partners, Singapore, Mr. Speaker, and Prime Minister Lee. Australia's engagement with these multilateral organisations, and particularly those smaller multilateral groups, Mr. Speaker, whether it be in ASEAN or the G7 Plus, or indeed, Mr. Speaker, the government's success in promoting the campaign of the former Finance Minister here, Matthias Cormann, to the Secretary-Generalship of the OECD, Mr. Speaker, has demonstrated Australia's agency in these forums, which helps keep Australians safe, helps keep Australia's economy heading in the right direction, Mr. Speaker, ensures that our defence forces are well supported and integrated with the many other important partners that we have operating in this region to preserve a free and open Indo-Pacific, Mr. Speaker, but also to favour a world order that favours freedom. That has been our purpose in engaging with so many of the countries of the world. And the G7 agenda, whether it's on the pandemic, Mr. Speaker, the issues regarding free trade, which I'll be discussing with the UK Prime Minister, or the many other issues that relate to climate change and global action, more broadly in multilateral fora, particularly in the World Trade Organisation, Mr. Speaker, these engagements are incredibly important to Australia's future. And, Mr. Speaker, it is with some pride that I can say that, particularly in relation to defence and the actions that we're taking on defence, that while Australia looks often to partners like allies like the United States and other partners, Mr. Speaker, we never leave our defence to other countries. We never leave it to them, Mr. Speaker. We look to them, but we never leave it to them. And Australia is a respected partner in these fora because of the engagement that we participate in, but also the capability, the investments, the self-sufficiency, Mr. Speaker, we seek to establish, which gives us that presence at these international fora. So I look forward to those meetings, Mr. Speaker, and for Australia continuing to play its part in a world order that favours freedom. And on that note, Mr. Speaker, I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.